Hi, from the Ross School of Business. This is session 2 of the Business of Healthcare webinar series. Our topic is the tricky, complicated business of getting a vaccine to the populations that need it. I'm Erik Gordon. I'm a clinical professor at Ross. Our panelists are Dr. Aubree Gordon, professor of infectious disease epidemiology at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and Dr. Jennifer Heller, whose PhD is in immunology. Dr. Heller is an associate partner at McKinsey & Company, where she co-leads McKinsey's vaccines and biosimilars service lines. We are actually going to loosely organize our discussion around McKinsey's framework for key activities in vaccine adoption. And, we're going to start with guesses at the schedule on which the first vaccines are going to be available, and we'll talk about manufacturing challenges. We're then going to discuss administering the available vaccines. Who's going to get them in what order of priority? Where are they going to get them? Who's going to administer them? Then we're going to move to questions about physical movement of the vaccines, supply chain questions about moving vaccines downstream from manufacturing to ordering, transporting, storing the different types of vaccines we might see. Then a big question about acceptance of a vaccine. Some of us will be first in line to get vaccinated. That would be me. But some people will wait and see, and some people won't get vaccinated unless they're forced to. We'll talk about how vaccine proponents can educate the public and beyond educating them, build their trust. Affordability. Who's going to pay for hundreds of millions of people getting vaccinated? And then accountability. Who's going to be accountable for the performance of these vaccination programs? How are we going to monitor, for example, whether both doses of 2-dose vaccines are actually administered? How are we going to track the duration of protection? How are we going to track adverse side effects? So these are big, important questions. Aubree, Jennifer, thanks for taking time from your packed schedules to share your expertise with us. Let's start at the beginning with availability. Aubree, what's the latest on which vaccines are likely to be available when, and what are some of the manufacturing challenges or unknowns that we will be facing?
So we actually expect the first vaccine to be available in the US very soon, maybe as soon as Friday or Saturday. The Vaccines Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, so they're going to make a recommendation to the FDA, will meet tomorrow. And if they approve the Pfizer vaccine, we could see it ship out immediately. Moderna, who's kind of the second up runner in the US, looks to be about a week or so behind, and could be available, by the third week of December. For others like Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine, we're looking at January, potentially February before those are available in the United States. The Pfizer vaccine has become available in other countries now, such as the UK, and was just approved in Canada. I think the big challenge, of course, is going to be to produce the vast number of vaccines that as quickly as possible. So we need a huge number of vaccines. This has never been done before, right? And these first vaccines are new technologies. And so that certainly presents some challenges on scaling up manufacturing, but people have been working on that. And those challenges will, of course, vary by vaccine and manufacturer. For instance, the Moderna vaccine has to be kept at very, very cold temperatures. That can be just challenging for storing it, of course, as you produce it. Moderna is, they're one of the front runners here, but they've actually never put a licensed vaccine out to market. And so that's going to be a bit of a challenge potentially for them as well.
So this has been Operation Warp Speed. It's interesting that we in the US, we won't know until maybe Friday whether the Pfizer vaccine will be authorized even for emergency use. And yet they started producing that. Jennifer, is that common?
Thanks for the question, Erik. I think what we're referring to here is what we in the industry call manufacturing at risk. And what that means is that the manufacturers of these products take the risk of scaling up their manufacturing operations before they know if the product will be authorized or approved for use in the market. And they do that so that the product is available at the time of authorization for use at scale. It's not common practices, at the scale that we're seeing today. And the reason that it's possible this time around is because many different stakeholders across the ecosystem have invested to make that possible. So not-for-profit organizations invested early on in a range of different vaccine developers. For example, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, invested back already in January in many of these different manufacturers or developers to ensure that they had the capital they needed to move forward as quickly as possible to respond to the raging pandemic. And then we see government investment as well. So significant investments from the US government and other governments to ensure that the manufacturers weren't restrained from scaling up their manufacturing due to financial considerations. And so it's, I think this is unprecedented, but we're also facing an unprecedented disease. And so desperate times require desperate measures. And so, so in this case, I think it was, it was made possible through the different investments here.
Jennifer, let's stay with you for a moment. Aubree mentioned that we could have as early as Friday Pfizer's vaccine approved, next week maybe Moderna's, but then probably not until January to think about AstraZeneca and J&J. Is it important to have more than one vaccine available? And how important is the order in which vaccines come out? Will the first vaccine that comes out own the market, or maybe slow the development or deployment of the later vaccines, which might be better in some ways?
That's a great question. So if we think about the overall pipeline of COVID vaccine candidates in development, the current status is about 275 different vaccine candidates globally in development, with over 50 of those in clinical trials already. So certainly a large pipeline following the four front runners that Aubree referred to previously. To the question of whether it's important to have a range of different candidates available, I think the answer to that is yes. And the reason is, one, we don't yet know if these products will be fully approved by regulators. The next 2 weeks would grant us potential for emergency use authorization, but there's still safety data requirements for another couple of months that would be needed for regulators to achieve full licensure and approval for these products. And so I think it's important to continue the momentum of development to ensure that we do end up with a product that is approved for use in broad population. Second of all, the scale of the demand for COVID vaccines is unlikely to be met by a single manufacturer. And so therefore, it's really important that we have a range of different products being manufactured to meet the global demand for COVID-19 vaccines. Whether the first product will, as you said, capture significant share in the market, I think it's a bit remaining to be seen. Certainly, the first products are important to address the unmet need in the market today with the need for preventing more infections. But the optimal product profile for a vaccine may not be aligned necessarily with those that are first in line. And what I mean by that is, the efficacy is one component of an optimal target product profile for a vaccine, and the Pfizer and Moderna products look very promising with the data of 95% efficacy. But in order to achieve full adoption, other considerations are important too, such as having a single dose vaccine versus 2 doses, which eases the complexity of administering these products, such as thermostability of these products at higher temperatures, which enables more more efficient transport and storage, particularly in low and middle income countries where they may not have established infrastructure that can support minus 20 degrees Celsius, which is sort of freezer temperatures, or even the ultra cold chain, such as minus 70 degrees, which the Pfizer product requires for long-term storage. So I think as we think about what the optimal product is to have in the market, it may look different in the next year than it does today.
So no one size fits all vaccine. Um, Aubree, when the vaccines become available, as they become available, a couple of questions. First question would be, who decides who gets them? And what criteria will they use to decide the priorities of who gets vaccinated first?
So I think I'll take that's an important, complicated question. I'll take the first part of that question first. So who decides? So in the US, we have a committee, the ACIP, that makes vaccine recommendations, not just for COVID, just for all vaccines. And they'll make recommendations. Those recommendations will go to the CDC. And then the CDC will make their recommendations. They'll decide whether to adopt the ACIP recommendations. However, ultimately, the decision for who gets vaccinated is going to rely with states. And so while it's expected that generally states will, follow those recommendations that come out, how they interpret the recommendations may vary a bit by state to state. And, they may decide to prioritize other groups as well. So that's who will make these decisions, right? But in deciding who to prioritize, that's really complicated, for multiple reasons, including the ethics of it. You have to think about a bunch of different issues. So we're thinking about severe disease, like who, if they get COVID, is most likely to die or have a severe case, because that's, of course, what we want to prevent, right? But we also have to think about transmission. Because just because somebody doesn't become a severe case, they may go on to transmit it on to, another 100 people. So what populations are really contributing to transmission? Because even if they don't have themselves a high burden of disease, they may be substantially contributing to that. We also need to think about essential systems in the US. We need certain things to function, like healthcare, for example. And so healthcare workers, they're at high risk, right? And we all need them to respond to COVID-19. And so they're clearly going to be a priority group too. Of course, there's the whole equity issue, right? Some populations have been hit much more hardly, I guess harder, by COVID-19 than other populations. And we need to think about that. So there's all these different kind of competing priorities. And then on top of that, there's just the logistical aspects of distributing this vaccine, which may need to be administered in specialized settings, and that will come into play too in setting those priorities.
So I wonder, I fear political conflict versus maybe ethics and other aspects. Over the last couple of weeks, it seems like people are crawling out of the walls with priorities. One that I couldn't help but notice is the Press Photographers Association said that they should be given priority because of the crucial role they play in disseminating information. So, and there's just been a whole string of folks, some of whom, you have to restrain from laughing at, although I guess if you were in that profession, you wouldn't. But I guess many of us like to think that we are crucial, but somebody is going to have to stand above it all and take probably a lot of political heat to decide you come third, they come second, somebody else becomes fourth. Something you kind of, you're happy that you're a bystander on. But you said something else that I think is interesting. If the states ultimately decide, you can imagine that a heavily urban state would decide something differently than a heavily rural state. but you get funny things like if you live near a state line, if you live in suburban Chicago and Indiana is 20 miles away, some people might get very different treatment just because of where they are over a state line. Could that happen?
That absolutely could happen. I don't know that that's what we're expecting to see, but it's definitely a possibility.
Does the I wonder, does the federal government have levers to make their recommendations very strong? So, for example, can they say this is the CDC recommendation, and people who follow it get more doses than people who don't, or people who follow it get more money than people who don't? Are there any practical levers that we might expect the federal government to use if they don't like the way a state is handling this? Just for either of you.
I mean, I think, yeah, we could certainly, that's certainly something that is in their toolbox. They use for all sorts of things, and they could resort to that if they're not happy with how states are distributing the vaccines, or how quickly they're distributing the vaccines too, right? That's going to be another open question that comes up if state X is very efficient at distributing the, and right now it's based on population, right? A percentage of the population in the states, where they're trying to distribute it very fairly or evenly. But what if state X distributes that vaccine very quickly while state Y is still sitting on 3/4 of it, 4 weeks later, and it's time to make additional shipments? That's gonna open up questions as well.
Or what if there's, an outbreak in a particular state, and another state's not suffering from it? Jennifer, let's turn to you for a slightly different angle on this, which is where are the places we're likely to get vaccinated? Many of us get flu vaccines where we work. I don't know how that's going to happen. Many of us get them at school. I don't know how that's going to happen. Where are we going to end up going to get COVID vaccinations?
It's a great question, and I think this is also one that will vary by state in the U.S. because, as Aubree mentioned, the states are, developing their own immunization rollout strategies, and so we may see very different sites of administration by state. I think early on, given the CDC guidelines in terms of the phases of who is likely to receive, or who is recommended to receive, the first wave of vaccines under emergency use authorization, I would imagine that the healthcare workers would likely receive their vaccines at their site of employment, which would be a health system or a physician's office. And I could also imagine that, long-term care facilities, which are also in that first wave, those products would be administered on site as well to the residents in those facilities. I think as we think further out in terms of the broader rollout of vaccines, we could see a range of different sites of administration, including health systems or hospitals, including retail pharmacies, which have been already tapped and in the news as one of the potential sites of administration. So places where you receive your flu vaccine or other adult vaccines like pneumococcal vaccines or shingles vaccines, CVS, Walgreens, name your local retail pharmacy, that could also be a potential site of administration. If we think about what we're learning this week from what's happening in the UK, some late breaking news today after their first day of vaccines rollout yesterday. They had a couple of adverse reactions with severe allergic reactions in 2 of the vaccine recipients, and have now released guidance, twofold guidance. One, that members of the population or consumers who have a history of severe allergy should not take the vaccine at this point in time, and 2, that sites of administration should have resuscitation capabilities on site. If those guidelines were to be adopted in other geographies, that would suggest that the sites of administration would be limited potentially to healthcare facilities who have all of that equipment and capabilities on site.
So that sort of leads to another question, Jennifer, which is, um, what about the populations that are underserved by existing healthcare facilities? They're not near one. In fact, even if you can go to a pharmacy and get it, there are large numbers of people, some of whom are in vulnerable populations, who live in a so-called pharmacy desert, where in fact, it is not easy for them to get to a pharmacy. Um, what is planned, or what should we be planning to serve those people?
I think it's a really important point, and certainly something that I imagine is top of mind for those leading immunization programs. We know that certain demographics, such as Black Americans and Latinx Americans, have been the most devastated by severe disease from COVID. And we also know that they may have challenges in accessing vaccines, as well as some concerns about hesitation to accept vaccines. So it's going to be really important to design immunization programs that reach these populations, that allow them both access and to build trust in the process of getting vaccinated.
One of the registrants asked us a question about mobile facilities to give vaccines, which seems like it could be pretty important for reaching people who, um, just don't have a pharmacy or a healthcare facility nearby. Well, it's not enough to just get these vaccines manufactured and sitting on a loading dock. We've got to move the vaccines to the patients. Interestingly, right as we speak, if you're watching this live, there's a White House meeting on vaccines with FedEx, UPS, CVS, some of the pharmacy chains to discuss some of these questions. What are some of the supply chain challenges for the likely vaccines? How do they vary across the vaccine candidates, the leading vaccine candidates? Um, uh, I guess, Jennifer, we could start with you on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if we think about the sort of chain of events that needs to occur post manufacturing, there's a couple of steps that need to happen. There's the actual shipment and transportation of the product, and then there's storage of the product, both at central depots and at more local sites. And then there's eventually getting the product to the site of administration and ensuring that it is appropriately stored, and in the case of some of the products, diluted before being administered and then actually administered. So there's a series of events that needs to occur. And it's important that these vaccines are maintained under certain conditions so that they retain their optimal efficacy profile. And what I mean by that is they need to be handled at certain temperatures so that they meet the thermostability requirements of the different products. So for Pfizer's product, for example, it requires dry ice shipment, which Pfizer has contracted their own distributor network to navigate, and needs to be maintained at very low temperatures, up until the week prior to usage, at which point it can be stored at standard refrigerated temperatures, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. For the Moderna product, it's slightly different. It has 30 days of stable life at 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, so standard refrigeration. So that may make it a bit less complex in terms of the requirements from a distribution and storage standpoint.
So, at this White House conference, we have, I think, if they haven't canceled, we have FedEx and UPS. Delta Airlines, some of the other airlines have announced, their readiness to move this. Aubree, that's the US. How do the supply chain issues look even in rural areas of the US, but also in other areas of the world that don't have the UPS, FedEx, don't have the same infrastructure we have?
Yeah, I mean, so in any setting, it's distributing the number of vaccines that we're talking about is going to be incredibly challenging. But as you just pointed out, in rural areas and low and middle income countries, it's going to be even more challenging. And that's in part because of some of the unique storage requirements that Jennifer mentioned, including some of the vaccines, or at least one of the vaccines, having to be kept at an ultra low temperature. I will say that a lot of work has been done, by the companies to design containers to hold the vaccines, to keep them at the appropriate temperature. That's going to help a lot. But there's going to be, a massive coordination effort, and that coordination effort is going to be more complicated in rural settings. In low and middle income country, particularly in rural settings and low income countries, I honestly think this is going to be prohibitive. The cost to distribute, vaccines that can't be kept in their, like, in all of these countries, they do have platforms set up for vaccinations, right? They give the childhood EPI. And so we really need vaccines, I think, for those settings that can be distributed through the existing channels, or there's going to need to be a substantial, or they're going to need substantial help, global help to fund those distribution efforts.
Yeah, I wonder, there's sort of an urban-rural split, that in urban areas, it looks very different not just in terms of the economics, but even if you had lots of money, how many people you can reach in a given day strikes me as kind of tough. Let's talk a little bit about acceptance. Aubree, might as well stay with you. We've always had people who oppose vaccination. There are people who oppose, childhood vaccinations.
Mhm.
There are diseases that could have been eradicated or we thought were eradicated that have come back. But seems as if there's some special challenges with getting people vaccinated against COVID. What do you think the special challenges are? What do you think is going on that's different about COVID?
Well, I guess I'll first just kind of address what are the normal challenges, right? So as you mentioned, there are anti-vaxxers. These are people who don't believe in vaccines, don't believe that people should be vaccinated, right? They feel very strongly about it. We've also got a whole population in the US who is what we call vaccine hesitant. It's not that they don't believe in vaccines, they're just a little bit more hesitant about the choice. So maybe they pick a different schedule, maybe they pick and choose which vaccines they're going to get or they're going to give to their children. And with any vaccine, any disease, we're going to run into those issues, and we'll have those issues with COVID-19 as well. But specifically for COVID-19, we face a number of challenges, as you mentioned. One challenge is that there's a subset of the population that doesn't believe that SARS-CoV-2 is a real threat. They kind of think that this entire thing is a hoax. Those individuals are probably, I would guess, a lot less likely to get vaccinated because they're not going to see the value in getting the vaccine. There's also a large group of people who normally wouldn't be vaccine hesitant, right? But they're worried about how quickly this vaccine or these vaccines have been developed, right? And there's a general fear of, did we miss safety signals? Was this done, to the standards that it ought to have been done? Were corners cut? How can you take a process that normally takes many years and shorten it to less than a year? And so there's a lot of concern on that front too. And those individuals are not necessarily saying that they're not going to get vaccinated, although some of them are, but they may plan to delay vaccination until they feel like the vaccine's been tested a little bit more, or the vaccines have been tested a bit more, as we should have several, and they're comfortable with the amount of information that's available for the vaccines. I would say another issue that we're going to run into, and I think, we may get to it a little bit more in during this panel, is that the vaccines do have some side effects. And once people start getting vaccinated, they're minor, but those minor side effects may also make people more hesitant to get vaccinated.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder about the side effects because some of them are flu-like, and will make people wonder what the vaccination gave them. In addition to the speed to market, I wonder if there's some other factors. So there's been publicity about the fact that certainly for the first couple of vaccines out of the gate, it's an entirely new technology that has not gone into successful vaccines in the past. And then the technology has an interesting name. It's mRNA, which to sciencey people means one thing, but I wonder if to other people it's like, oh boy, they're messing with my RNA, they're messing with my DNA. What are going to be the long-term effects? Do you think any of that's also going to
Uh,
play
I
into it?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that the fact that these are new technologies that haven't been used in the licensed vaccine before in humans, do make people more hesitant. And yeah, hearing mRNA, I've heard that from some of my family members, right? They're like, wait, they're injecting genetic material into us. What will that do? And so I think some really careful communication is needed to educate the public about this technology, or at least particularly people who are hesitant because of it being a new vaccine, and specifically mRNA.
So I wake up and at one point I like to think, well, of course the anti-vaxxers will be against this. And then I talk to some of my colleagues and they are in sort of, Aubree, your category of sort of the hesitators. Let me just wait and not be the first online. They're highly educated people. Jennifer, McKinsey turned up really interesting data on the attitudes of healthcare providers. I mean, people who are really knowledgeable about this. Data on the attitudes of the healthcare providers themselves towards the COVID vaccine. You walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, very happy to. So as part of some of our internal research that we conduct, we did a survey with healthcare providers in collaboration with Sermo back in September. And when we looked at about 30 plus physicians that we surveyed, about 30% or so said they were uncertain or unlikely to recommend COVID-19 vaccination to their patients. The concerns that they cited listed, potential concerns around side effects, the unproven experience with the vaccine, and also cited a desire to see how it affects other people before recommending it themselves. And so I think given the importance of healthcare providers as a major source of trusted information for most consumers, I think it's really important to ensure that healthcare providers have the appropriate education that they need, so that they understand these vaccines and they can feel confident in their decision to recommend a product to their own set of patients.
So, Jennifer, I wonder if we can take that beyond even sort of like the healthcare providers, because some of the organizations that used to be accepted by many of us as sources of unbiased science-based information, I'm thinking of people like WHO, CDC, the FDA, are viewed by fewer people as being as being credible. I mean, some of them have waffled back and forth and have said, go left, no, don't go left, this many days, that many days, yes through the air, not through the air. what could they be doing at their level to be seen as more credible by people who've, lost faith in the organizations that we used to have a lot more faith in?
I think transparency of information is really important here from all stakeholders. And what I mean by that is transparency on what is known and what is not known. Because certainly at this point in time, and especially before the products, the vaccines have reached full, excuse me, full approval, they will still only be emergency use authorized. And so I think just being very clear in the communication about what we know about these products, what we don't know about these products, will go a long way in building trust in the community. I think it's just really critical that it's a fact-based discussion with information from, from primary sources that allows people to really understand what is known, what is not known, and when they will know more information to have an estimate of timelines, because there are still uncertainties here. We don't have the long-term safety data yet. We don't yet know whether these vaccines are also effective at preventing transmission. We know that the effectiveness is against preventing infection and preventing progression to severe disease, but there are other unknowns, and just being very clear about what is known, what the facts support, and what they don't support, I think will help in building trust and confidence.
Yeah, this might be a good time to take a slight detour here. Either one, if you want to. We've used the term emergency use authorization a bunch. We've talked about what we don't know. Um, Maybe just a quick thumbnail on what is the difference between what Pfizer or any company needs to show to get this emergency use authorization versus what they will have to show to get actual FDA approval. What's the delta? Which I guess is a sort of a backwards way of saying, tagging on, Jennifer, to your theme of being aware of what we don't know. What would we know? What is it that we don't know under an emergency use authorization in EUA that we would know if we had full approval? Who wants to jump on that one?
I'm happy to start. So I think that the key difference at this point in time between the emergency use authorization and the data that's available at full licensure is the long-term safety data. So for both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, they have achieved the completion of their phase 3 case accrual. And what I mean by that is they now have met their target endpoints of how many COVID cases they needed to see across both the placebo and vaccine arm to assess efficacy. What we don't yet have is the regulatory requirement fulfilled of 6 months of safety data post the second dose product. And so basically, if we think about the full trial, the developers have inoculated their full set of participants with both doses of their vaccines, but they have not yet accrued the required safety data to assess longer term safety of these products. And so that is where, when we get to the point at which these developers file for biological licensure approval with the FDA, it will likely be in that March, April timeframe when they've met the 6-month safety requirement.
So I wonder, what is the history? This is I'm asking a question that I actually don't know the answer to. With vaccines, looking at prior vaccines, which actually use a different technology than these first two mRNA vaccines, but what is the history of serious adverse effects showing up, 4, 5, 6 months out as opposed to early on? Which I guess is a way of saying, should we actually expect any surprises, running out the safety data? Might be an unfair question because we don't have mRNA vaccines, but what have we seen in other vaccines?
I mean, what we've seen in other vaccines is it's, if you're going to have serious adverse events, like on the whole overall, it's definitely much more common to have them close in than further out. But they can occur further out. And, they could occur 6 months out. They can occur and even further than that out. Like, for instance, the dengue vaccine, which is against dengue fever, was actually licensed. And then it became clear that naive individuals, people who had never had dengue before, were actually at increased risk of severe disease from the vaccine. And we know why, and it's a very different process than anything we would expect to see with COVID-19. But this is a new disease, and so it's possible, but much less likely than severe adverse events occurring close into vaccination.
I recall one of the things I was told early on when I started thinking about healthcare industry is that the FDA and its counterparts around the world have an incredibly hard job because they have to balance saving people's lives and safety and efficacy. And it's a tough balance because has there ever been a medicine that didn't have a side effect on somebody? I mean, has that medicine existed? It probably has, and I just don't know about it. But this balancing of, there are going to be some side effects. What's the severity of them? How do you balance? Okay, I got the fever and I felt like I had the flu for a couple of days versus, well, you didn't get COVID, or you didn't get COVID and maybe didn't transmit it to somebody else. It seems like it's a tough balancing act. But for people to expect that there will be a vaccine or any other kind of medicine for anything else that ever ails any of us, where there are no side effects, that'll be a very long wait. But one of the things that I think we don't know is we don't know about this vaccine in certain populations. The vaccine wasn't tested on everybody. Let's chat for a couple of minutes about who it wasn't tested on and why it wasn't tested on them, and what that means going forward. That's a toss-up question.
Well, so I'll start it off, I guess. One of the groups that the vaccine wasn't tested on is young children. It hasn't been tested on kids under the age of 12 at all. And in fact was more recently extended to be tested on, kind of adolescents, so 12 to 15 years of age. So we don't have any data in for young children on the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine. There are other populations, as we already kind of touched on a little bit, that have been excluded from the vaccine trials because they have specific comorbidities, or because they have allergies, right? That we, once again, don't have that safety and efficacy data on.
So I don't want to think about this as a comorbidity, but also pregnant women.
There were some pregnant women in the trial, but not very many. Their pregnancies are continuing to be monitored at this point. And there wasn't, I'm trying to think, I don't think there was certainly no like red flags or anything, but there's really kind of a lack of data on that group.
So Jennifer, is this some kind of nefarious plot? We leave out the children. We love our children, but we leave them out, or even the disinclination to include a large number of pregnant women. Why does it come down that way, at least in the first round of trials?
So typically in the first round, especially in the case of COVID-19, we want to test in adults because of the informed consent process, and also because of the I would say the severity of disease was much higher in adults and elderly than it was in the pediatric population. And so in that case, the target for the first wave of vaccine trials was focusing on the adult segment of the population. Now that we have efficacy and safety data coming from these adult trials, I would imagine all of the developers are focusing on designing their studies for children and thinking about the appropriate dose scale that they need to consider for pediatric populations.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's you see a lot in a lot of clinical trials. So much so that the FDA, for example, has had to push drug companies to extend trials into the pediatric population. But certainly, there's a difference in the disease burden here. Well, look, I'm from the business school, so let's turn to the grubby subject of money. Aubree, who's paying for these? Hundreds of, just in the U.S. alone, hundreds of millions of doses. Who's paying?
The US government is paying, which means we're all paying for the vaccines, right? It's going to be taxpayer dollars when it comes down to it.
What is the government so far actually paying for?
They've bought a specified number of doses from vaccine developers, and in fact, they bought doses before the vaccine was developed. Kind of, agreed to that, and usually also in the contract have the ability to buy more. They've also, paid for other pieces of scientific development. They're certainly paying for systems to distribute the vaccine.
How about for the actual healthcare providers? So if you are the Acme County Department of Health, or you're just a doctor, are they going to be paid?
Yeah, I mean, they will be paid by somebody, but I do not believe that has been completely figured out at this point. Jennifer might have.
Yeah, some of what I have seen is that CMS has put out some guidance on the reimbursement rate for administering the two vaccines. I believe it averages out to about $22 per dose is what the CMS will be reimbursing for administering COVID-19 vaccines. But of course, there are also segments of the population that are insured by private payers. And so I would imagine that they are in the process of figuring out what that reimbursement rate and process will look like.
Yeah, for people who don't know all the acronyms, CMS is basically the Medicare, Medicaid, which is a huge proportion of the population. Let's talk about some of sort of the follow-up accountability questions. So Jennifer, we can stay with you for a minute. Maybe we get the vaccine out to the people, we get people to take the vaccine, we get it paid for. But that's not the end of all that we need to get done. What are some of the accountability issues we need to be addressing?
So I think a couple of the issues would be ensuring that, I think you had mentioned this at the beginning of the call, ensuring the the course completion of the 2-dose vaccine courses. So that will be one important component to ensure that the population is protected as much as possible against the disease. And so there are, I think, varying accountabilities there, which, some of which would fall on the side of administration to remind consumers to come back for their second dose. But I think is a less clear accountability on who actually owns that particular piece of the puzzle. I think there's also the standard post-market surveillance and monitoring, which the pharma companies who've developed the vaccines will be responsible for, the same as if this were any other drug released into the market.
So one of the things I wonder about second doses relates to information that came out yesterday. Again, yesterday from the live version of this, where we got a look at the materials that the FDA staff prepared for the FDA Advisory Committee meeting that's going to be tomorrow. It shows that for the Pfizer 2-dose vaccine, that if you take both doses, what appears to be, based on the trial data, a surprisingly high, a really cheerfully high effectiveness rate, higher than we would have been willing to accept, I think. But it also shows something else, which is kind of interesting, which is if you take, even after the first dose, it shows some effectiveness. I wonder if that's good news, bad news, and I'll set up the scenario why I'm asking you this. If we have people who take the first dose and the news is, oh, look, the first dose is pretty good all by itself, and then they have some kind of adverse effect. They have soreness, or they get the chills, or they get a fever. Could make this tracking the second dose, getting that second dose, pretty important, because even though there is some decent effectiveness after the first dose, in terms of getting control over the pandemic, the effectiveness number of doing 2 doses as kind of a public health good seems really important. And also another thing, the drug companies, of course, are obligated under existing rules to track adverse effects. They vary in how much effort they put into that. I think there'll be a lot of effort put into this. How about, is there anything planned for tracking the duration of protection? Another kind of important public health aspect of this.
Yeah, so I guess I could start with talking about that kind of effectiveness or efficacy following the first dose. So, it was about, I think it was 52%. It's a very short period of time, right? We're talking, a 3-week period of time between the doses. It's fairly sparse data at this point. And so, not an exact number really, even though we can calculate an exact number. I would also say that it is a big question, but we have no idea how that would have worked further out. For example, what would that have looked like? And further out, it might become more effective, right? Because it takes you a while, particularly after a first exposure, to mount a protective immune response. It probably took 2 weeks before people really started getting a solid immune response from that first vaccine. And so it might get more protective, right? But it also may not be nearly as durable as 2 doses of the vaccine. And in fact, that's what I would expect to see, of course, but we don't know for sure because we haven't seen it yet. So there's that. There's also the question of, well, okay, so let's say it really was 52% effective. So you could run it in models. It might make sense, right? To vaccinate twice as many people, right, with a vaccine that's 52% effective versus, half as many people with a vaccine that is, 90 or 94% effective. But it really does depend, in part on, well, what does that other 48% of the people look like? Like the people, or not quite 48%, but the people we're missing, the people who do get infected, how sick do they get if we see a lot of severe cases? And the other issue and what comes into play, and we really don't know at this point, is herd immunity. Right. And can people, who are vaccinated, who are protected from getting infected, can they still who are protected from getting sick, right? Because that's actually what the trial's monitored for. Can they still get infected and potentially transmit on the virus? We don't know the answer to that question. And that would help, we would need the data for how well it actually works with 1 dose. Right now, I would say the data's not there. 2 doses for everybody. Looking at getting the vaccine is absolutely the way to go. So we need to know how well it actually works. But to really figure out what is the better scenario, we would need to know that information about transmission as well. So from a public health level.
So it sounds like, thank goodness, we have these good-looking vaccine candidates, but there's still we're not done. There's still plenty to learn and still plenty of tough decisions to make. Aubree, your scenario of depending on how the manufacturing and distribution goes, is it better to spread single doses over a larger number of people? Tough questions that you hope will be driven by enough data and by some pretty good models, as opposed to sort of political screaming back
Yeah,
and forth.
I think it will be driven by data. And right now we don't have the data to support one dose. That's, I just want to stress that that's absolutely certain right now.
Yeah, I mean, in your description of this, it's important for people to understand, um, um, how vaccinations work. Not everybody understands it. That it isn't actually the vaccine that protects you. The vaccine puts things in motion in your body, to build the protection. This would never get me a passing grade in an immunology course, but for those of us who don't have to, um, pass Janeway or any of the immunology stuff, just think of the vaccine instigates things in your body to protect you, and that's why for some people, maybe after 1 week, maybe after 2 weeks, maybe after 4 weeks. It'd be interesting to see how that varies across, if there's a lot of variance in that. Well, let's wrap up with this kind of question. What are some of the biggest things we should have learned from the vaccine piece of COVID, from the vaccine development piece of COVID, the vaccine administration piece? What are some of the biggest things we should have learned from that we should apply in the face of the next potential pandemic? Or even if you forget pandemics, in the face of other diseases around the globe, because there are other diseases around the globe that are having ravaging effects. What are some of the biggest things that we hopefully have learned?
Well, this may sound a little self-serving in a way, but I would say for me, one of the biggest things that we've learned is there's been a massive investment in science over the last few decades. The technologies, like the technologies that were used to identify the virus, to make the vaccine so quickly, have been developed because of those investments in basic science. And I think we need to pay attention to that, because that scientific, that background, those platforms were already under development. We were able to take, if you compare like SARS-CoV-2 in SARS-CoV, sorry, in 2004 compared to SARS-CoV-2, in 2019, it took us over 6 months to figure out what virus was causing, the disease after we knew that we had a problem. This time we're talking a matter of weeks, right? Before the virus was identified, scientists were easily able to go in based on research that had already been done on coronaviruses and say, like, look, the spike, we know that is, like what the immune system seems to target. We can identify these sequences on the spike that are likely going to be a good target. And they were able to run immediately with making the vaccines. And so I personally feel that's one of the biggest lessons we've learned from this, or at least
that's kind of interesting because not everybody realizes you just don't walk into a laboratory and say, all right, we're going to come up with a vaccine. Think of this as a pyramid where there's lots of science and technology, including failed science, that tells us what to not waste our time on, that are the different levels of the pyramid before you get to the top. But it's also what you say is also interesting in the context of the fact that over the last, 15 or 20 years, a lot of this basic science that used to be done at drug companies who used to have their own massive laboratories doing basic science, it's not being done there anymore. They have it's not that they've outsourced it, but they rely on people like startup companies to do the earlier work, and universities, and other nonprofit laboratories around the world to kind of carry this burden of giving us the knowledge that the big drug companies used to do tons of this stuff, and now for a whole variety of reasons, which would be another whole webinar, they're doing relatively little of it. So all of those lights that are on late at night, in laboratories, wherever you live, it does form some of the basis of our being able to react differently. Jennifer, what's a lesson you've got?
So I think, first of all, significant optimism around the innovation that we've seen in the past year. If we think about the previous fastest developed vaccine in history was about 4.5 years from start to finish, and this was the mumps vaccine. We're now looking at less than a year, assuming we get authorization for some of these products this month. I think there are a couple of things that made that possible. One is the economic incentives thrown at this problem, right? So significant resources invested from a range of stakeholders. I don't have the data to support this statement, but I am pretty confident saying that we've seen more resources invested in COVID than any other infectious disease at a single point in time in history. And so I think that resource-rich environment allows innovation to thrive. Second would be that there has been real collaboration across a range of stakeholders that have enabled this to be possible. Certainly, we've seen, pharma companies who have historically been competitors partnering together. If you think about, for example, Sanofi and GSK with their vaccine candidate. We also see biotech and pharma partnering together with, for example, BioNTech and Pfizer. And then we see collaborations with academia and pharma in the case of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine candidate. So I think that collaboration has allowed shared learnings to accelerate the development timelines of these products. And then I think the third piece is the close communication and collaboration of the vaccine developers with regulators to ensure from the beginning they're on the same page about what the expectations are for a product to be approved for use in the market, and to ensure that there is rapid review of data as it comes out to accelerate the process and eliminate as much white space as possible in between the different stages of development. So for example, we saw in the case of COVID, we saw many parallel running processes where there was still non-clinical analyses, for example, animal studies or other assays and cellular assays that were running in parallel to the initial phase 1 clinical studies, which allowed the product to go into humans as soon as it was proven safe, but still to continue to assess different factors of efficacy. And similarly, we saw roll-ins of phase 2 to phase 3 trials to eliminate the white space that typically happens between those different phases of clinical study. And that was facilitated by the interactions with regulators to ensure that there was no time wasted in the development process.
It'll be interesting to see going forward how much of that sort of FDA flexibility is applied more generally. Is it just going to be when we have a pandemic, or are there lessons that could get cures or at least treatments out for other things, which, while it's not a global pandemic, if you are the person suffering from it, getting something out now rather than next year could make a big difference. Takes two to tango on that one. It takes flexibility on the FDA, but also it takes a certain amount of sort of openness, transparency, and forthrightness on the part of companies. we saw some things which, you might not have expected. For example, from Pfizer saying, wait a minute, here's a more realistic timeline, or, look, this data looks good. We want to see more data. You don't always see that from the drug company side. Anything else? Any other big lessons that struck you from this that we could do differently?
I would say another lesson, on the more public health front is, and I feel like we knew this and yet we didn't do it well, in my opinion, is communication is incredibly important. And I think that there were probably some pretty big lessons to be learned about how information about SARS-CoV-2, in the very beginning was kind of communicated to the American public, and how it was communicated, really throughout this entire thing, and really to some ill effects, I would say, like, so I think there's a big lesson to be learned there as well.
I think maybe the only thing I might add is on the topic of pandemic preparedness more broadly, and ensuring that we take the time to reflect on what we could do better in the face of another pandemic going forward. I think the vaccine mobilization was very, I would say, very rapid and enabled the development timelines to be compressed. I think there were probably some lessons that could be extended to therapeutics, because there wasn't as much mobilization early on. There wasn't as much of a structured framework with an organization like CEPI, which I mentioned earlier, that enabled the kickstart for vaccines. That doesn't exist right now for therapeutics. And I think, going forward, it would be optimal to have a similar organization and structure that would enable rapid development of therapeutics, because I think early on we expected we would have therapeutics much sooner than we have seen them come to market. And we're actually looking at timelines that are comparable to vaccines, which minimizes, I think, the role that therapeutics may be playing or could have played should they have been available sooner.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Well, we're getting to the end of our time. So thank you, Aubree Gordon, a professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And thank you, Jennifer Heller, is co-lead of McKinsey & Company's Vaccines and Biosimilars service lines in the McKinsey Pharmaceutical and Medical Products practice. Thank you to those of you who sent us questions, many of which we used. And thank you to all of you who are listening live or recorded. Please watch for details of the next two webinars from the Ross School of Business of Healthcare series coming in February, one on healthcare policy. Pretty good timing. February will be a good time to talk about maybe changes in healthcare policy. And the fourth and final one will be in March. Thank you. Have a great day.